Hello, welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Assembly Member Richard Gottfried, and in the New York State Assembly, I represent the neighborhoods of Chelsea and Hell's Kitchen, parts of Midtown and Murray Hill, the Lincoln Square area and Flatiron. It's an incredibly diverse area. It's also an area that has some of New York's most treasured historic features, and one of the things we will be talking about today is the issue of historic preservation and preserving our architectural heritage, and with it some of the human scale development that I think makes New York especially important and valuable to all of us. Our guests are first Andrew Berman, who is the Executive Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. And while my district doesn't include Greenwich Village, actually Andrew is involved in a lot of historic preservation issues beyond Greenwich Village, including our area. And as I recall correctly, you live in my assembly district.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And our second guest is Fern Luskin, who is co-chair of the Friends of the Hopper Gibbons House. And we will hear a little more about what the Hopper Gibbons House is and why it needs friends. Fern, along with Julie Finch, was one of the co-founders of the Friends of the Hopper Gibbons House on West 29th Street. So I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is what is at stake with historic preservation in New York City. We've got lots of old buildings. Why is it important to keep them? What does that mean to the average New Yorker? Andrew, you want to start?
Sure. I think that it's incredibly important to a lot of New Yorkers, even sometimes if they don't realize it. It's the scale and character of many of their neighborhoods. It's, in a lot of cases, the most distinctive features of their neighborhood. It's things that are beloved touchstones. It's everything from, a lovely street of historic row houses or turn-of-the-century apartment buildings, but it's also a part of the history of our city and our collective history, whether it's immigrants, movements for social change, political movements, developments in technology, all of which are reflected in the history of our buildings and our built environment. And given the incredible development pressure our city, and especially this part of town, faces, without things like historic preservation, we'd probably lose that. And so you'd mostly see buildings that had been built in the last 5, 10, 20 years constantly being replaced. And while there's an upside to that, there's a significant downside as well. And that's why preservation is so important.
I'll get back to you on a couple of things about historic movements. But on that theme, Fern, if you can tell us just very quickly what the Hopper Gibbons House is all about, because that also has an extraordinary history in New York.
Right. It's unique, it's special, it's sacred, because it is
And what is it and where is it, for starters?
It is, it's specifically 339 West 29th Street. And what happened there was that it served as an underground railroad station, which was a place that gave refuge to slaves literally running for their lives to Albany, to Canada. And in those days, and this was 1863, it was illegal to harbor slaves in underground railroad stations. So this was a very secret activity of leading the slaves to the different
Although the family
stations.
was very prominent in abolitionist activities.
And they were well known as abolitionists, and all the major abolitionists visited the Gibbons family there, including Frederick Douglass. And that's why, actually, in 1863, when the draft riots erupted in New York City, the mob specifically attacked that house.
What's happening there now is that the current owner has done a lot of construction work on the building. It's now shrouded in dark netting that makes it kind of ugly. One of the things that he's doing is building an additional floor on the building. And I know one of the things that you're most concerned about is precisely what's happening with the roof of the building. And what's the significance of the roof of the building?
Right. The reason that is so important is because during those draft riots, Mr. Gibbons and his daughters escaped the mob by running over the rooftops from their house to the neighboring four-story row houses. And what the owner, the current owner of the Hopper Gibbons house has done is to build a fifth-story addition to that formerly four-story row house. And he did it illegally when he didn't even have a valid building permit, as the New York Supreme Court proved unanimously a little over a year ago. And he did it after it was landmarked, a year after it was landmarked, stealthily on the interior of the building.
Yeah. Andrew, one of the, I guess, most recent designations in New York is the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village and some surrounding areas. Now, that was not done through New York's half-a-century-old landmarks preservation law. It was done through some techniques that we're not all that familiar with in New York City. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. So just in late June, the Stonewall National Monument was designated by President Obama. So this is done through it will be administered through the National Park Service. And this is the first time that any site anywhere in the country has been designated a national monument based upon its significance to LGBT or lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender history, and particularly in relation to the civil rights movement. So that means that it's in the same category as things like the Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon, many beloved historic sites throughout the country. And this is something that people had been working towards for a good 2.5 years, spearheaded by the National Parks Conservation Association. And it was very important to recognize this special history. Now, the federal government, to its credit, actually long before New York City even, recognized the special contribution that Stonewall made to American history. In 1999, my organization, working with some other groups, got the Stonewall and the surrounding area listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is sort of one notch on the ladder, so to speak, of federal recognition of historic sites. National Monument is kind of the top of the ladder. And that was a first step as well. It was the first time that had been done. In 2015, we spearheaded an effort to get New York City to designate Stonewall an individual landmark. And that was the first time any individual landmark in New York City.
That's the inn itself.
Yes,
yeah.
the building itself on Christopher Street was designated a landmark. You would think that the federal recognition would be most important, and it certainly is symbolically, but in a very tangible way, and I think this speaks to what Fern was just talking about. The city designation is so important because it's actually only city landmarking that physically regulates the structure, protects it, prevents demolition, alteration, things of that nature, whereas the federal recognition is largely symbolic. It really only comes into play in a regulatory way if there's state or federal dollars involved or some other kinds of actions. So the city landmarking is the thing that really protects the structure. That's why it's so wonderful that Fern and Julie spearheaded the effort to get Hopper Gibbons and the surrounding houses landmarked, and that's why there's the ability to fight this, although it's a fight that's obviously far from over.
So being designated a national monument, I mean, if you own a building and the federal government comes along and the president says, bingo, you're a national monument, if you were designated a New York City landmark, that means you cannot tear it down, or at least you're breaking the law if you do. You can't change the exterior, et cetera. Do any of those protections apply solely because of being a national monument?
So the national monument is largely educational, and typically what happens is, but not in every case, national monuments are owned by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
So because they're owned by the federal government, if they're then also designated a national monument, then the government itself is committing itself to preserving it. In this case, the federal government doesn't own Stonewall, but as part of this process, the city of New York gave them possession of the Christopher Park, which is located right in front of it, which is very connected to and integral to the history of the Stonewall riots. So the federal government does have a sort of physical place there, but in this case, it's the park. And so while the Stonewall in itself is part of the designation, it's really the city designation, at least at the moment, that is what protects that building from ever being torn down or having something built on top of it or something of that nature.
You know, under New York's constitutional framework, if land is designated or used as a public park and you want to undesignate it, the city can't do that, or at least is breaking the law if they do, which would be a topic for another show. But occasionally the legislature will pass a bill, usually at the request of the local assembly member, to allow use of a piece of parkland for a non-park purpose. Usually we insist on getting new parkland in exchange from the town that wants to do this. And I remember when the bill came up to to undesignate or to allow the transfer of the Christopher Park, a lot of us said, what? We don't, why would we want to do that? And of course, Deborah Glick, the assembly member who was sponsoring it, explained, well, this is so it can be basically federal park, and this is a good thing. This gives it additional protection, significance, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
So it was a small little piece of that transaction showed up on our desks in Albany. Fern, in the case of Hopper Gibbons, and this fight has been going on, we've been doing this, I don't know how many years. We've been demonstrating 9 years in front of the building and press conferences and writing letters and whatnot. There were issues about work being done without building permits, or after building permits were revoked. After a few years, we got the City Landmarks Preservation Commission to designate that row of buildings as a quote-unquote historic district, which is basically being a landmark, but it's for more than just one building. Part of our topic this evening is what are some of the loopholes and limitations in our laws, and I guess if anything demonstrates some of the weaknesses of our laws, it's the story of what the owner of the Hopper Gibbons House has been able to do. Can you tell us a little about that and what you've been trying to do to get this back on track?
Well, some of the things that have gone on are, they relate to the Department of Buildings, which is supposed to supervise all, that all codes are enforced.
Yeah.
But this particular owner did some underhanded things. He pretended that the fifth story had already and always had existed, when clearly this building was a four-story row house, and he has done more damage to it than the rioters did in 1863.
Well, he's got modern construction tools at his disposal. Right.
And now, incidentally, he wants to, in order to keep his illegally built fifth-story addition, he wants to sort of buy off the neighborhood by telling us he will put nice bricks on the facade, and that he will put the cornice, which is like the overhang on the roof line. However, he is the one that stripped all of that in the first place, in approximately 2008 or 9.
I don't think people in the neighborhood, until this all began, had any idea of the historic nature, or the role of the building in the Underground Railroad.
And if I could just say how incredible of an accomplishment it was that they were able to document that this was an Underground Railroad site. At this point, the only documented Underground Railroad site in Manhattan. By their very nature, these were secretive, so there may well have been others, but we may never know where they were. certainly down in the Village, there's often legends about buildings having had some connection to the Underground Railroad. There was some very active abolitionists downtown as well as in Chelsea and other places. But to be able to actually show and prove the things that happen is an incredible rarity. And that's one reason why it's so important that this building and the surrounding buildings be preserved, and why it's so odious and unfortunate what this owner is trying to do to this building.
Yeah.
And I knew that there was a document out there saying that this building had been an Underground Railroad station. But because of a faulty footnote in someone's book, it couldn't be found. But one day, I did have a hunch, and I went to the library, and there it was. It was an eyewitness account of Joseph Hodges Choate, who was a very close friend of the Gibbons family. And there he states that runaway slaves that were trying to escape to Canada were sitting at the Gibbons family's dining room table with the family.
Now, you are both actively involved with the Save Chelsea organization, which is made up of individuals and a lot of the block associations in Chelsea. One of the efforts that Save Chelsea is now working on is trying to preserve 404 West 20th Street, which is, I gather, the oldest surviving building in Chelsea, and it goes back to 1830. What is happening to that building, and what is so special about it?
Sure. What's happening with 404 West 20th Street, which is located just west of 9th Avenue, speaks to a lot of issues that are facing preservation in New York City right now. It's this wonderful, lovely old house, as you said, the oldest in Chelsea. It's located within the Chelsea Historic District, so it's landmarked. So you would think its future would be safe. A new owner, however, who has purchased it, has applied to the Landmarks Preservation Commission for permission to basically demolish everything but the facade, and to rebuild a new structure behind it that would be bigger and taller and would eliminate an open alley that has separated the house from the building next to it since it was constructed, which kind of gives you a unique perspective on the building. We're seeing applications like this more and more.
Also, I think, as with Hopper Gibbons, they want to build something on an addition on the roof.
They want to build an addition on the roof as well. That's correct.
And excavate.
And excavate underneath.
And
Right,
in our case, there's bedrock.
Yeah.
So it would be dangerous.
And so the landmarks law, I mean, there are things called interior landmarks, like the Great Hall of Grand Central Station is an interior landmark. But ordinarily, the landmarks designation does not protect the interior of a building.
That's right.
And under the landmarks law, an owner can apply to, I suppose in theory, demolish a building, but also to make alterations to it. That requires the approval of the Landmarks Commission.
That's right.
And this is now all before the commission?
That's right. So it's in the process of the commission hearing this application. We're seeing these kinds of applications happen more and more because what's happening is these beautiful historic houses that are landmarked have become more and more desirable. So you have people of greater and greater means purchasing them. Now, the fact that they've become more and more valued reflects a wonderful trend, but the downside of it is that the people who will pay $5 or $10 or $15 million don't necessarily want to live in what is actually a small 3-story modest wooden house. What they want to do is dig down, add stories on top, blow out the back, get rid of all of the historic interior. And as you mentioned, landmarking.
So they enjoy living in the lovely neighborhood. They enjoy that their property is more valuable because of the rest of the neighborhood. They just want to make things worse for their neighbors by messing up their building to give themselves more space.
Sometimes that's absolutely true. And so, there really does have to be a balance. The owner does have the right to make changes to the interior. They can make additions if they are sort of discreet, not highly visible, don't really compromise historic characteristics of the building. And some owners have done that in very sensitive and creative ways. But sometimes it's basically everything but demolition, and that's when it can become a much more serious problem. And I think that's why people are so upset about this one.
Yeah. Now, you know, I think we've seen in the case of Hopper Gibbons, having a good law in the books is great, but if people are willing to just run off and break laws, that doesn't mean the police are going to descend on them and take them away in handcuffs, apparently. But we just saw in New York City what is widely regarded as a significant weakening of the landmarks protection law. Can you tell us a little about what that law does?
Yeah, Intro 775, which was passed by the City Council and recently signed by the mayor, would in fact weaken the landmarks law, make landmarking more difficult, demolition easier. Basically what it would do is, for the first time, it would impose these very strict do or die time limits for designation of a building. 1 year for an individual landmark, 2 years for a historic district. And if the commission doesn't act within the prescribed time period, the building is automatically no longer considered for landmark designation. Now, a prior version of the bill would have then put a 5-year moratorium on reconsideration, which was particularly odious. There was a huge backlash against it, and this 5-year moratorium was removed. But they did pass the bill still with this 1 and 2 year drop-dead deadline in place. And the concern is sometimes these are complicated or difficult, or you have a resistant and well-connected property owner who can delay the process, try to run out the clock. And so we fear that it will make the Landmarks Preservation Commission less likely to take on these more challenging or complicated proposed designations, and give resistant owners an opportunity to beat the process simply by running out the clock.
Yeah, I gather part of the problem with the Landmarks Commission is that a lot of its backlog is because the City Council and the mayor keep it persistently on a fairly short staffing. And so getting the work done quickly can be difficult.
Absolutely. It's the smallest of the city's, I think, 100 or more city agencies, and they're charged with regulating what is currently several thousand properties and looking at the entirety of the city for other potential landmarks. So they're very, very understaffed and under-resourced, and here they're being given this very large new mandate and these very strict timeframes and no additional resources with which to accomplish that. So it's very concerning. We think it's going to make it easier to demolish buildings and harder to preserve our city's history.
If we were looking to strengthen the landmarks process, which certainly I would like to do, and I'm sure both of you would, and I think most of my constituents would. What are some of the things that we should look at in the landmarks law and maybe in the city buildings department and other things?
I would really strongly suggest that we have a liaison between the Department of Buildings and the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and that this liaison should be someone who has just the interests of our historic legacy at heart, such as an historian or an architectural historian, not someone that's purely pro-development.
Yeah.
A better coordination between the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the Department of Buildings is key. I think giving the commission more resources is key. And I also think putting in place more protections while a building is being considered for landmark designation would also be important, given that this process does often take a year or two more. You want to make sure buildings and neighborhoods aren't destroyed in that time period before the decision is made.
As I understand it, there is some protection that applies once a building has been calendared by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, but I guess they can be studying it for some period of time before it is, quote, calendared.
Right, and they often do, and that's often the most vulnerable period of time. And even when it is calendared, the protections are very minimal, and they're not actually enshrined in the law. It's currently an interdepartmental agreement between the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the Department of Buildings. Because it's not written in the law, sometimes it can slip through the cracks.
Right.
And all it really is it
Probably
says,
difficult for a community to try to enforce.
right,
Yeah.
that's very true. Really all it does is it gives the Landmarks Preservation Commission sort of a 40-day window to act in order to designate before the Department of Buildings will issue things like demolition or alteration permits. And 40 days is often not a lot, and especially if you're considering a very large district. We have seen many buildings destroyed or compromised during that 40-day period.
Sometimes these things happen at night, even when neighbors have been victorious in their fights to save a building. It's happened a number of times.
Yeah, we've historically had situations in New York in which in the middle of the night developers just bring in bulldozers and smash the building that they want to tear down, even though that's illegal, and and nobody comes along and takes them away in handcuffs. So people who are breaking the law often can get away with it. So I think our work is not done. We're about out of time. So I just want to thank you both for coming in today. I think we've given people in the community a lot of good information. I just want to close by saying I'm Assembly Member Richard Gottfried. My community office is at 242 West 27th Street on the ground floor between 7th and 8th Avenues. Our phone number is 212-807-7900, and you can email us at Gottfried, Gottfriedr, at nyassembly.gov. And if you forget all that, if you just Google the New York State Assembly, go to our website, you can find the contact information for all of us. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to Andrew Berman from the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, and Fern Luskin, co-chair of the Friends of the Hopper Gibbons House. Thank you all for joining us. Hope you'll tune in again.